Hi history lovers, welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday on all aspects of history, though I do have a soft spot for royal history and historical mysteries. Today on History Calling, we're looking at the life of Mary I, who was also the first Queen of England, or at least the first one to be able to actually hang on to the throne. In particular, we'll be looking at her early life, which started out well, only for her world to fall apart when her father, Henry VIII, chose to abandon her mother, Catherine of Aragon, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Stay tuned to hear how Mary reacted to the divorce of the century and to find out what it was like to be caught up in one of the greatest scandals to ever rock the Tudor dynasty. While you're here, please also remember to like, share and comment on this video and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me over on Instagram where my username is History Calling. If you like the Tudors, why not check out the other videos in my Tudor Monarchs series and my series on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I'll leave them linked in the description box, along with links to lots of other resources such as books, movies and TV shows, which you can check out if you'd like to learn more about Mary and her family. Princess Mary Tudor was born at Greenwich Palace on the 18th of February 1516, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. 3 days later, in the nearby Church of the Observant Friars, she was baptised and proclaimed Princess of England. Her godmothers were Princess Catherine, Countess of Devon, who was the King's aunt, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who was a cousin of Henry's mother, and the Duchess of Norfolk. Her father's favourite, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, was her godfather. As the only heir to the Tudor dynasty, Mary was an important pawn on the European stage during her early childhood. At the age of just 2.5, she was betrothed to the French Dauphin Francois in October 1518, and she was precocious enough that she asked his proxy, because baby Francois wasn't there, if he was the Dauphin of France. If so, Mary said, she wanted to kiss him. Royal politics being what they were, however, this betrothal didn't last long. Despite a successful meeting in France between her parents and the French King and Queen in 1520, known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, during which, by the way, Mary stayed in England and held court at Richmond Palace, the marriage alliance with France was soon repudiated in favour of one with Spain, and by the Treaty of Bruges, Mary was engaged to her maternal cousin Charles V in 1521 at the age of 5. This only lasted 4 years, however, until Charles, who was 16 years her senior and in need of a wife and heir, threw her over in order to marry Isabella of Portugal. Mary never gave up on her Spanish family, however, and if you come back for the video on her reign, you'll see how she ultimately did manage to become Queen of Spain, albeit several decades later than intended. Mary was exceptionally well educated and very academically able. Her mother Catherine sought the advice of leading scholars of the day as to how best to have her daughter raised in order to prepare her to be the Queen Regent of England and, she hoped, Queen Consort of Spain, and she appointed Mary's godmother and distant cousin Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, to be her governess. The princess was taught languages, she was able to write in Latin by the age of 9, and schooled in the classics, including the writings of Plutarch, Plato and Cicero. A strong religious component was given too, and Mary was raised an ardent Catholic, but there was also time for the so-called feminine accomplishments, and the princess was comfortable showing off her abilities. She was able to impress a French delegation who visited her in 1520 by playing the virginals for them, and a Spanish delegation with her dancing in 1522. 5 years later, another French delegation were also treated to her musical abilities, and she was able to converse with them in French, Latin and Italian. Despite the grand marriage plans and the education fit for a princess, there were threats to Mary's position. She had a half-brother, the illegitimate Henry Fitzroy, who had been born to Henry VIII in 1519 by one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Blunt, and the king toyed with the idea of making the boy his heir in lieu of a legitimate son. He granted him a slew of titles and privileges in June 1525, including making him the Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and Catherine was alarmed at the prospect of her daughter being superseded in the succession by this child. She was soothed, however, when Mary, who was never officially declared Princess of Wales in her own right, was nevertheless treated as such by her father, by being sent to oversee the Council of Wales and the Marches in August 1525. There she had a royal court numbering over 300 servants and befitting a princess and the heir to the throne. A far worse threat to Mary's position than her brother ever posed was about to emerge, however, and her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had been a lady-in-waiting to Mary's mother Catherine since about 1522, but her father Henry only began to take serious notice of her in roughly 1526. Things moved quickly, and in the face of Anne's refusal to become his mistress, Henry began proceedings in 1527 to have his marriage annulled on the grounds that it was incestuous, as Catherine had previously been married to his brother Prince Arthur. I've covered the Henry, Anne and Catherine love triangle and the struggle for the annulment in my videos on Henry and Anne's relationship and on whether Catherine slept with Arthur, both of which I'll leave linked on screen and in the description box, so I'm not going to rehash everything here. In short, Catherine fought Henry every step of the way, and the process took 6 years. For Mary, this period of time was a psychologically damaging experience, as she found herself stuck in the middle of two exceptionally strong-willed parents. There were periods of calm when things were almost as they used to be, such as the month the royal family spent living together in Wolsey's house in 1528 while they were sheltering from an outbreak of sweating sickness. But these interludes became fewer and farther between until they stopped altogether. Henry did still visit Mary sometimes, seeing her at Richmond in the summers of 1530 and 1531, but there was to be no more happy families with Catherine. In an effort to drive her away, Henry told Catherine to choose between him and Mary, and warned that if she went to see Mary, he would potentially not have her back to court. Catherine therefore refused to leave him. The recently appointed imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis blamed the king's increasing neglect of Mary on Anne, saying that the latter was jealous of the princess and the love the king had for her. The situation deteriorated further in 1531. Mary saw her mother in May for what would turn out to be the last time, though neither of them knew it. Henry then banished Catherine from court in July and forbade her from seeing Mary as a punishment for her resistance to the annulment. He never relented on this cruelty, even as the toll of the situation tore Mary's health apart and she begged to be allowed to see her mother. The best the two could do was communicate by letter in secret. In late 1532, Anne fell pregnant, and in January 1533, Henry, who argued that he had never been married to Catherine in the first place and so was free to wed Anne, did just that. The marriage to Catherine was declared void by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, on the 23rd of May, making Mary illegitimate. If she thought the worst had happened, she was wrong. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September, and Mary was ordered to give up her own title of princess now that a replacement had arrived. Henceforth, she would be known as the Lady Mary. She struggled to believe that her father would do this to her, and wrote to him saying as much, and still signing herself as a princess. Henry responded by sending the Earl of Oxford to tell her in person that he had indeed stripped her of her title and that he did not consider her legitimate. Mary refused to back down, telling him that she could not renounce the titles, rights and privileges which God, nature and her own parents had given her. Henceforth the two would be at war with each other, with Mary always at a disadvantage as she found herself on the receiving end of her father's increasing abuse. At the end of the year, insult was added to injury when the 17-year-old was made to move to Hatfield House without her own attendants and wait on her baby sister as little more than a servant, and an imprisoned servant at that, for she couldn't leave even to walk in the gardens by herself. The humiliation was unbearable. Mary refused to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess, saying that she knew of no one in the land who held that title but her, and continued to refer to Anne Boleyn as Lady Pembroke, which was the title Henry had given her before their marriage. For Catherine's daughter, the only queen in England was her mother. Eustace Chapuis suspected Henry and Anne were trying to do harm to Mary too, saying that she was separated from her beloved governess, Lady Salisbury, who, he had heard, offered to serve the princess at her own cost with a good and honourable train of servants, but her offers were not accepted, nor will they ever be, for were the said lady to remain by the princess, they would no longer be able to execute their bad designs, which are evidently either to cause her to die of grief or in some other way, or else to compel her to renounce her rights, marry some low fellow, or let her fall a prey to lust, so that they may have a pretext and excuse for disinheriting her and submitting her to all manner of bad treatment. Mary was held under the watchful eye of Anne's aunt and uncle, Sir John and Lady Shelton, and her life was a misery. Chapuis reported that she wept constantly and that the princess has only one chamber woman with her and is in the worst lodging of the house. When Anne Boleyn heard that her stepdaughter was eating her food in her chambers, she ordered this stopped. The girl was not to eat unless it was in the main hall, and if she declared herself to be a princess, her ears were to be boxed. Catherine told her to obey the king, "In everything save only that you will not offend God and lose your own soul." But it wasn't enough for Henry. When he visited Elizabeth in January 1534, he refused to see Mary, though she looked down from a terrace at the top of the house as he was leaving, and he acknowledged her with a bow and a touch of his hat. She wouldn't see him again until 1536, and he was unrelenting in his callousness towards her. Lady Shelton was not quite as cruel as Anne wished, and was in fact criticised for being too lenient on her charge, but she was still unkind. Furthermore, Mary's jewels and other possessions were taken from her, so that by February 1534, just 2 months after her arrival at Hatfield, the girl who had been a princess a year earlier had been imprisoned, starved, threatened with physical violence, reduced to a servant, deliberately put into substandard accommodation, forbidden from publicly attending Mass in case she was cheered, and had virtually no clothing left. This torment would carry on for over 2 years. In 1534, the Pope finally ruled that Henry and Catherine's marriage was valid, but it was too little, too late. Soon after, an Act of Succession in England vested the crown in Henry's heirs by Anne or any future wife, completely cutting Mary out of her inheritance. It was also made mandatory for the king's subjects to swear an oath to uphold this new succession. It was now incredibly dangerous to speak up for Mary. A nun named Elizabeth Barton, who had publicly supported the former princess and her mother by making prophecies about Henry's doom if he married Anne, and saying that he had forfeited the crown by doing so, was horribly executed along with 5 priests in April 1534. Catherine and Mary both refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the act, and in response Catherine was banished even further to Kimbleton Castle, while Mary's only friendly maid at Hatfield was dismissed, having been suspected of helping to get word of Catherine to her. Other servants were also soon removed, and several sent to the Tower for addressing Mary as princess and holding private conversations with her. The girl was now watched constantly. Hardly anyone was allowed to visit her, and when Elizabeth received guests, her elder sister was kept locked in her room. Increasingly, Mary feared for her life. Anne Boleyn had made repeated threats to her well-being. Henry's minister Thomas Cromwell openly said that he wished both her and Catherine dead, and in early 1535 Chapuis reported that she had been told that she must renounce her title and take the oath, and that on pain of her life she must not call herself princess or her mother queen, but that if ever she does, she will be sent to the Tower. The psychological toll of all this was immense. Weeks later, just before her 19th birthday, Mary fell dangerously ill. Some suspected poison, but the doctors Henry had attend her blamed much of her illness on sorrow and trouble, and recommended that she be allowed to see her mother. Henry still refused, and blamed Mary's problems on her own behaviour for refusing to bow to his demands, and on Catherine's influence on her. He did move her to another house, nearer Catherine, but only so that her mother's doctors could more easily attend her. Mother and daughter were still not allowed to meet. More and more of their supporters were being killed too. After Henry's Act of Supremacy in November 1534 made him the head of the Church in England, he had John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Thomas More, formerly a great favourite of his, executed for refusing to recognise his new position and for their support of Catherine and Mary. Mary herself now seriously began to consider fleeing England. On the 5th of May 1535, Chapuis wrote to the Emperor that, "As to what is contained in your last letters about getting away the princess, my man returned from her this morning and has reported that she thinks of nothing else than how it may be done, her desire for it increasing every day." She was right to be afraid. By the end of the year, Henry seemed to be moving towards having her and her mother killed. Armed guards were placed around her residences, and on the 6th of November Chapuis wrote again to Charles V that The Marchioness of Exeter has sent to inform me that the King has lately said to some of his most confidential counsellors that he would no longer remain in the trouble, fear and suspense he had so long endured on account of the Queen and Princess, and that they should see at the coming Parliament to get him released therefrom, swearing most obstinately that he would wait no longer. The Marchioness declares this is as true as the Gospel, and begs me to inform your Majesty, and pray you to have pity upon the ladies, and for the honour of God and the bond of kin to find a remedy. On the 22nd of November, another letter, this time to the Empress from a Dr. Oritz, reported that he had heard from Catherine that she felt it, quote, likely that she and the Princess will be sentenced to martyrdom, which she was ready to receive in testimony of the Holy Faith, as the Cardinal of Rochester and other holy martyrs had done. The situation looked dire, but Henry wouldn't have the opportunity to kill Catherine. She died at Kimbleton on the 7th of January 1536, aged 50, and most likely from cancer of the heart. Mary was devastated. Chapuis worried that she would die of grief, or that the concubine, which is what he called Anne, would have her killed, as she had long threatened to do. The Emperor Charles wrote to his wife, Empress Isabella, that, of the Princess, my cousin, I hear only that she is inconsolable at the loss she has sustained, especially when she thinks of her father's past behaviour towards herself, and of the little favour she can expect for the future. I trust, however, that God will have pity on her, and will not permit the great injustice which has been shown to her to remain without some reparation. This reparation wasn't to come from him, however. With Catherine gone, he began more friendly overtures towards Henry once again. Mary had now reached the nadir of her young life. Her mother was dead, her emotionally abusive father was estranged from her and possibly plotting to have her killed, encouraged by Anne Boleyn, who was to Mary the stepmother from hell. Her half-sister had her title, her claim to the crown, and all the honours Mary had once enjoyed, while she was a prisoner, constantly ill and with virtually no one left to turn to, many of her supporters having been brutally killed or kept from her. The king, who had once doted on her and whom she had adored, had done all he could to break her and destroy her sense of identity and self-worth. The girl who had been raised to believe she would be Queen of England and likely a queen consort of another great European nation, was now told that she was nothing but a royal bastard and the product of an invalid and incestuous union to boot. We can only guess at the long-term trauma these 9 years between 1527 and 1536 had wrought on her. If you know anything about her later life, you'll know that she in her turn would be guilty of some terrible atrocities, which we'll come to in later videos. But if anyone deserves the title of a damaged princess, it's Mary, and I think it's worth remembering what she'd been through in her formative years and just how much she lost and suffered when seeking to understand, though not excuse, her actions later on. She'd also shown great strength and courage throughout, however, and she would continue to need both in the years to come as she fought her way to the throne. Make sure you come back next week to learn why, as terrible as things looked for Mary at the beginning of 1536, it would actually be the year that the tide slowly began to turn in her favour once again, albeit at a steep personal price. In the meantime, let me know below what effect you think her parents' annulment and Henry's treatment of her had on her personality. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.